So, hello and welcome to my adoring fans, and this is a sort of special episode of Conflict Middle East Political Simulator. This time I'm sort of going to do more of a strategy guide, as it were, as opposed to just a sort of playing through the game. So, don't know what happened there, but this is my fantastic map of the Middle East. We all know that Libya is a perfect square. And I've crossed off all the countries that do not play an active role in the game, so Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, etc. So you've got Libya, Egypt, Israel, of course, that's the country you play of, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They're the countries which actually play an active role in the game. So I'll first start off by going through each country in general. So Libya, it only borders Egypt, and it's a lot worse off militarily than Egypt. Egypt is the strongest military in the game, so you really do not want to aggravate them early on. Libya is quite militarily weak. It is capable of developing nuclear weapons, but only in the sort of very long game. Stability is probably about even, in the middle, difficulty to destabilize. So then we'll go on to Jordan. So Jordan is quite stable in terms of it takes a lot of time to destabilize them. It's not capable of developing nuclear weapons, but it's not all that strong militarily either. It cannot sustain an attack from either Israel or Syria, so it borders Israel, Syria, and Iraq is what it borders. And it's weaker than both Syria and Iraq. It's quite stable. So then we go on to Lebanon. Now, Lebanon is the weakest country in the game, both in terms of internal political stability and military strength. Israel can actually destroy it by with using one brigade of soldiers, so it's very weak. If it goes to war with Syria, it dies in a turn, just as generally, unless there's some other confounding factor, Egypt will kill Libya in a turn. So it only borders Syria and Israel. So then we'll go on to Syria. So it is capable of developing nuclear weapons. I don't know if I missed out to say, but Egypt is also capable of developing nuclear weapons. Syria, nuclear capable. It's about on par with Israel militarily at the start of the game. Obviously, as the game goes on, Israel can purchase a lot more weapons, potentially with US financial aid, should it get it. So it's about even, and it's moderately stable. It generally tends to start off quite stable, but if it wins a war, as with all countries, they boost their internal stability with every war to the highest rating, which is very solid. So then let's go on to Iraq. Iraq is capable of developing nuclear weapons. It borders both Syria and Iran and Jordan. So it will win versus Jordan in a war. It's about even versus Syria or Iran. So and we'll get on to Iran now. Iran is also nuclear capable. It's about as militarily strong with Iraq, maybe a bit more so. And it only borders, for the purposes of this game, Iraq. So there's the sort of map. The goal of the game is to destroy the governments of the 4 countries which surround Israel, so Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. This can be done either by using the nukes, coupping them via funding insurgents, or winning in a conventional war. Those are your sort of 3 ways you can remove a government from power. The rest of them don't matter. So, they do matter, but not for the purposes of the win condition of the game. So there's the map and the countries involved. So I will now explain how the sort of diplomatic system of the game works. So when you click on a country, well, press enter on a country, you get this screen. So you'll have a diplomatic menu, an intelligence menu, and then that just goes back to look at the other countries. So if we go to the diplomatic menu, you will have either do nothing, you will have try to improve relations, or intentionally degrade relations. If you go to the intelligence menu, you will have stabilize the government by fighting the insurgents. You'll have support the insurgents to destabilize the government. And you may have, if you have a strong insurgent group, which you've built up over a few turns, they then become ready for action. So that means they can attempt to either coup or assassinate the leader of the country. Now, the chances of success of that depend very well on the stability of that country. So they sort of degrade. So if it says weak, very weak, fragile, it can then begin to work. If it says firm or very solid and you try to do a coup or an assassination, it's just not going to work, and you're going to get caught and it will reduce your relations. So the relations in general have sort of like a hierarchy. So you have the worst is deplorable. Well, the worst is, sorry, at war. Then you've got deplorable, lamentable, indifferent, satisfactory, workable, profitable, excellent. So you can degrade or increase your relations 1 point on that scale per turn. So indifferent is quite an important one, because so basically if you're indifferent, the other country, if it's a neighbouring country, has the option to do what's called a border dispute. So that means they will either declare a airstrike on your civilians or an industrial target, and that will cause a border dispute, as it says in the picture there. Border dispute between Egypt and Israel is aggravated relations. So that will then put you on lamentable. So once it goes lamentable, it never recovers. So it always ends up going to war. So you have lamentable, you have that 1 turn sort of grace period. The next turn, it will go deplorable. So, and then they invade. They invade at the end of the turn where it went deplorable. So there is a bit of nuance. I'll get onto the manoeuvring troops later, but if they have a nuclear installation, it goes lamentable. You can still bomb their nuclear plant and then have enough time to deploy forces to there before the AI invades. So a good idea, what may be good for your first few games, is to write down the status of your relations with each of your neighbouring countries at first and keep track of it for a few turns. So if you say have workable relations with Egypt, and then it goes down to satisfactory on the next turn, and then it goes down to indifferent on the next turn, they're overwhelmingly likely to border dispute you, and so that direction of travel in the first few turns is highly important to the game. So that's sort of a tip for anyone who's not played before. Sort of write them down, your 4 neighbouring countries. So yeah, right. So as well, a way you can sort of tell which way before it's going to go is it might say in the official news bit, it might say the diplomats are behaving aggressively towards us or acting aggressively towards us, I think it is. That can be like a prelude to the relations beginning to go down. So you need to sort of watch that. As your relations build, it may say too friendly with opposing factions, where you can't build up your relations further. That only seems to happen when you're sort of going for the top levels of relations where it's excellent, and you might sign a military pact with them, give them aid, etc. So it might say too friendly with opposing factions, and then it will likely give you, say, it might not always tell you actually, it might say, but it might say something here like, this government is unsatisfied with our relations with, say, Iraq. And then you might want to kill your relations with Iraq. So prestige is another thing. So that's sort of countries with sort of like higher prestige, it seems. I'm not exactly sure how the prestige system works, but countries with high prestige seem to get like bigger ideas about invasions and the like. So sort of like if you have way higher prestige than a country, there'll be less maybe kind of like wanting to attack you, as it were. Don't know why it took me so long to find that word, but yeah. So after you've done the sort of diplomatic relations, so I'll explain to you before I go into that, I'll explain to you the general strategy for the diplomatic relations and what you sort of want to do for each country, as it were. So generally with all my neighbouring ones, unless in very specific circumstances I'm trying to degrade them using the intelligence, as it were. Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, you're trying to degrade them because it always keeps open the option to coup them. Iran as well. There is no situation. There's niche situations where you want to stabilize your neighbors, but there is no situation where you want to stabilize Iran, because Iraq and Iran, both nuclear capable countries. So, and it's going to sound really unfair, but if Iraq drops nukes on Iran, or Iran drops nukes on Iraq, well, they can mutually assured destruction each other with nukes. Or I think it's as well, if the tension in the Middle East gets too high and someone uses nukes, it ends the game. So that's why it's always, you want to try and get rid of Iran as fast as possible. Because there's no situation where they can benefit you. Iraq can benefit you in many situations, because Iraq can attack Syria, which is about even in military with, or Jordan, which is much stronger. So Iraq can do Israel's dirty work unintentionally in many situations. So say, for instance, Iraq-Syria war is a very good war for Israel, because generally, if you can get rid of Egypt and Syria, you've won. They're the two countries which stand in your way. There are some games where you end up with a border dispute with Syria and a border dispute with Egypt right at the gate, and there's nothing you can do. But so normally, I stabilise Iraq and destabilise Iran, so it can work against you, because Iran is slightly military strong, so it can extend a war for a long time if they are to go to war, which they commonly do. That is the only sort of disadvantage of doing it. But so Iraq generally I stabilise, as I mentioned before. Libya, now Libya's a funny one, and I've been sort of playing around with it. So I'll mention, if I haven't already, that if a country is victorious in a war, also not just victorious in a war, but gets to be the controlling power after. So basically, you'll have I'll scroll down because I have a picture here. Each war will have a line like this, a front line. Once that front line there goes to Egypt, that's the win for Israel, or vice versa. So if a country is in a multiple front war, it is the country which pushes the front line all the way to the back which claims the victory. And you'll get oftentimes the headline, where your headline will say, if I just say, it will say something like, Israel and allies claim victory over Syria. So that means you get to be the controlling power. And if that happens, you get your stability of your nation to go to the strongest, which is very solid if you are the controlling power. So This also applies to Israel as well. It doesn't have exactly an insurgency in the same way that all the other nations do. It's sort of represented by the Palestinians. So your Palestinians stabilize and are not as hostile to the Israeli government if the Israeli government is winning wars in this game. So Libya, there's two schools of thought. If I perceive I'm going to war with Egypt, I want to have as strong relations with Libya as possible. So if there's an early war with Egypt on the cards, I'm seeing the relations degrade or their border disputing me, then I want to be as good friends with Libya as possible and stabilize Libya as much as possible, because Egypt is the strongest nation militarily, but based on the way it can deploy its troops between the two wars, it can still lose. So there are games where you get Egypt on you right out the gate, and Libya comes to your aid. Even though Libya is a lot weaker than Egypt, if it's split on a two-front war, Libya can potentially win. So in that case, but there is potentially situations where you might want to destabilize Libya, because if you don't think an early war with Egypt is on the cards, I've sort of been experimenting with destabilizing Libya and trying to coup them, because it takes a long, long time to degrade Egypt's stability. So, for instance, if you degrade their stability, degrade it over like a year, they can then war Libya and get it right back up again. So, also, there is a very rare circumstance, I don't think I've ever seen it, where Libya develops nukes and uses them on Egypt. Can't use them on Israel, you can only use them on bordering territories. It's very unlikely, because the way the mechanics of the game work, you've got to start the war with an invasion, survive the turn, and then you can use nukes. But Libya is very rarely going to survive the turn. That's just based on the way the maneuvering forces works in this game. So it's very minor threat for Libya to develop nukes. It's never, and potentially use them. So there's sort of Libya, you can choose either way based on the situation. Iraq, you're generally stabilizing, but it can hurt you. You're sort of stabilizing in the hope that it wars your allies and you'll be able to see off Iran. But there potentially is another school of thought where you're just going to say, I want to get rid of Iraq as fast as possible. You could say stabilize Iran, destabilize Iraq. I don't think that would be a very good place statistically, but someone may say, well, you're kind of taking a risk by keeping Iraq around, and you are to a certain extent. I've lost games from Iraq-Iran nuclear war. Never Iraq-Syria nuclear war. I think I maybe one or two. So there's sort of that. So generally speaking, as well, in the early game, it's quite chaotic. So you may try to be nice with all your neighbours, but there is another school of thought where if you're very good with, say, Egypt and Syria, and war is unlikely with them, you can hit Lebanon. Now, why would you want to hit Lebanon? And it's because it's very easy, and it weakens Syria essentially, because it removes Syria's chance to hit a very weak country and then boost its stability back up. Syria often starts on firm stability, not very solid, which is the best. So if you are able to hit Lebanon and win, it takes a while. If you're going to use one regiment, battalion, I can't remember off the top of my head right now, Lebanon will survive a turn. If you use multiple, I don't think it will. So you can potentially try and get rid of Lebanon to stabilize your Palestinians. Get the extra prestige, and to de facto weaken Syria by stopping it from getting an easier country invasion which it can stabilize itself on. So there are niche circumstances where you can do that. So let's move on. So I'll move on to the second menu in the game. After you've done all your diplomatic relations, you get a policy screen. So you can purchase arms. So you've got 4 options: United States, Britain, France, private dealer. So private dealer is a South African who specializes in Soviet Union equipment. So buying from the United States is good. The United States sells everything apart from light tanks. So I believe off the top of my head, Britain sells bombers, light tanks, heavy tanks. France sells fighters, light tanks, heavy tanks. Yes. And private dealer sells gunships. I don't use him that much. He doesn't sell light tanks, I know that, but I think he sells everything else. However, when you buy so what happens is, if you buy from a mainstream dealer, you will get the weapons ready to deploy on the next turn. But if you buy so the next time you see that screen after you advance the turn, you'll have the weapons ready if you buy them from a mainstream dealer. But with their private dealer, it will take maybe 1 or 2 turns. There might be a lag on it. There may not be. There may be a lag on it. So the reason why buying from the United States as much as you can is a good thing. Although I would recommend buying fighters from France because they're cheaper from France. Is that if you eventually get access to anti-SAM gunships, which are really good at sort of building a balanced attacking force, and also every January, although not the 1st January, you get US financial aid, provided you haven't either been too brutal on Palestinians, which you very rarely would have been, or used nuclear weapons. You will get financial aid generally between sort of $1 billion and $3 billion, which is a large amount. So 328 million is a standard sort of budget, but you will get 10 times that potentially from the United States. You'll also get the option to increase defence spending and size of army. However, this causes you problems in the long term. So sort of like, if you do that, you want to probably be winning the game within a year and a half, because eventually you'll start seeing in that national security briefing at the bottom of the screen, you'll start seeing like the Knesset is trying to remove you, or confidence in Israeli premier reaches new lows. You're straining the economy, and the people don't necessarily like it when you put too much money into defense and not into other things. So what was I just rambling about? So you have also on this screen, you have the strategic actions. I'll cover them in order. So you have an example of this screen. So you'll sort of see what you do is, when you buy an AWACS plane, which I always recommend you do, if you're about to go to war with a country, it will say surveillance warning, build up on Jordanian border, for example. It will say that here. If you click on a country yourself, the options you are given will depend on the relations you have with that country. So, for instance, if you're very good relations with them, you will only be able to either tactically strike their nuclear installations or deploy a small-scale deployment. So if you do a small-scale deployment, that will deploy 1 unit, and a large scale will deploy 5, but you have to be, I think, you have to be within 1 relations from a border dispute to get to that. So yeah, you then get the option to bomb industry or bomb civilians. So bombing industry or bombing civilians, again, is like you're doing a border dispute, but I don't think the world likes it. It doesn't seem to make that much difference there. So you will get the option to full scale deploy or do those things. But you will also, with regards to destroying nuclear installations, if you have very strong relations with the country, say for instance, like excellent, profitable, etc., you have carte blanche to bomb all their nuclear installations. It won't really annoy them that much because it's not really something they should be doing anyway, developing nuclear weapons. So doesn't really degrade the relations that much. You can generally, it will degrade them once that you can get them straight back though. But if you are indifferent and you bomb their nuclear installation, that's going to trigger a war. Now you may want to do that. If you are inclined to do that, you can. So I'll mention here, there's a note about moving troops. So as I was talking about before, if you do a small scale deployment, that's one. Is it brigade? Yeah. So you normally start off with 7 brigades, about 2,000 of these tanks, about 200 jets. Not very many of these. Not very many of these. Not very many of these. So obviously, surveillance active means you bought the AWACS spy plane, and bombers means you can bomb the nuclear installations or civilians or industry, but generally only bombing nuclear installations is that worthwhile. So it will deploy. What was I talking about? So it will deploy 1 brigade. So a note on manoeuvring troops. Say, for instance, you're in a war with Syria. You've got 5. No, we'll just say Egypt as it's already on the screen. Say, for instance, if you're at war with Egypt, but next turn, Lebanon is surrendered here, but Lebanon is going to attack you. So if you click Lebanon first, you'll have no options because let's just say the whole of the Israeli military is on the Egyptian border. If you go to Lebanon, you'll have no option to deploy. So you think, I've lost the game then because I'm about to be invaded by Lebanon and I've got no forces. What you want to do, however, is you want to go to the Egyptian border and then it will give you the option to withdraw a single brigade. And then that single brigade can be deployed on a new border in the same turn. So that's a note on manoeuvring forces. So, or say, for instance, if you had one stationed in Palestine, you could go to the Palestinian problem menu, pull it off, and then put it on. Here, I believe you could do that. I've never been in a situation where I have done that because generally I win wars to stabilise my Palestinians instead of anything else. I should notice that you don't get any stability increase if you coup a nation, only if you successfully war it. So that's a note on manoeuvring troops, but you have to go to Egypt first. So you have to click on Egypt, withdraw a single brigade, then put it on the Lebanese border. So that's just a note on manoeuvring forces, and that would be sufficient with Lebanon. With Jordan, 2 will not win you a war, so you would have to see you're going to war when you get lamentable, take one off. You will likely survive a turn from Jordan. So if you had nukes, you could then, that 2 brigades will survive a turn. You can nuke them, then put them back on Israel the turn after. Egypt the turn after, not Israel. So there's sort of like more advanced troop maneuvering. So normally when you're in a war, you get a bunch of options like increased SAMs. Increased tanks. Most of the time, you're going to be just deploying all extra forces though. So Nuclear Club. So it costs $20 million. It will say often like It will take 3 months, it will take 2 months, it will take 1 month. It doesn't actually mean that, though. It means there's 3 phases to developing nuclear weapons. Essentially, each time you put money in the nuclear club, you roll. So, what may happen is you pay for it. You can even pay for it when you're in debt. It doesn't matter. If you've got a negative budget, you can still pay for it. It will just drain it from the next month's defense budget. So let's say it says 3 months to go. You pay for it. It just means you have a statistical chance now of advancing to 2 months, then a statistical chance of advancing to 1 month. Now, I don't know the exact mechanics of this game. I've never really seen under the hood, as it were. So this guide is sort of going to be limited in a way. It's just from my own experience. I don't have a manual for this game because I've only got into it a few years ago. So I don't have like a manual for it. I can't tell you what the exact odds are, but it can vary wildly. You can have nukes within 5 months. You can go for 2 years and not even get nukes. So now we're going to the Palestinian problem. So there's multiple ways of dealing with the Palestinians. So they're oftentimes not that much of a problem. Say, for instance, if you win a war in your first year, the Palestinians are not going to be a problem for you for the rest of the game. Likely. So they can be aggressive very early on. You sort of go from, I think it's completely under control is the best, and then under control, and then I think it's like stone throwing youths or something, and then you get the highest one just before the Israeli government collapses is like terrorist actions or something like that. They start hijacking buses. They do peaceful protests at first, then they do violent protests, and then they assassinate the Israeli leader if you let it go on for too long. So you have the following options. One is just do nothing, leave it to the Israeli police. Normally, if you're winning wars, that won't matter. That will just keep it completely under control. Some games, they're more aggressive, so you might want to station them if you've got military available. Again, you can pull it off at any time. And then you can do soft and hard tactics. So it looks like, because when I played one game where I lost through the Palestinians, I think that's the only game I've lost through the Palestinians. I did hard tactics near the end and it still didn't work. So I think it is kind of a snowball effect, as you'd have to do them early on. So generally it degrades relations with doing the hard tactics, sort of reduces relations with the US. So Israel is unique in that at the summit. So you get a summit, so you get every July a UN summit. So you'll be given a few options generally. One of them might be, if you're in a war, they might say, make peace. With them, you get to keep the territory you've gained. Although most of the time, you just go back to war with them anyway. I think you get your relations up to only satisfactory when you declare a peace deal. So that can just go indifferent border dispute in 2 turns. And you're kind of back where you started. Although the territory gains have been kept. So one of your neighbouring nations, provided they're still alive, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, can offer to take control of the Palestinians. So if Lebanon volunteers to do it, you definitely just do it, because you get a prestige gain out of it, and you're never really going to go to war with Lebanon. If you do, it's going to be easy. Lebanon and Jordan doing it is generally a good thing. Syria and Egypt wanting to take control of the Palestinians is a bit more difficult, because I've talked about this front line. So that means if you say give the Palestinians to Egypt, your front line, instead of starting in the middle for the war, is going to start back, maybe here. So you've got more territory now to conquer, which is that new Palestinian land which you've given up from your borders. So as you may end up in potential long, grinding wars with those nations. It depends. Obviously, if they're about to fail, you give them the Palestinians, you coup their government, and you don't have to worry about them ever again. But yeah, so there's that sort of like nuance. So another note on long wars is there can be something which is kind of out of your hands. When you are in a war with a country, you lose all ability to blow up their nuclear installations, unfortunately. So if I start a war with Egypt, the war goes on for a year. At 6 months, they decide to build a nuclear station. I can officially do nothing about that because you don't get the option to tactically airstrike when you're actually in a war with them, unfortunately. So that's why a long war is always a risk. If they decide to develop nuclear weapons in it, you're kind of done for. So if you can, defeat them. So it's always a risk to go into a long war. So it's generally normally safer to coup Egypt and stuff like that, unless you can defeat them quickly. Again, other nations are sort of similar to you on nukes. I think it's going to take them maybe about 6 months to do it. I've seen shorter, but yeah, they generally develop nukes in about 6 months to a year. Maybe they're similar to Israel. Maybe they have the same mechanic as Israel. I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen one of them go really long, like 2 years, to develop it. So now let's go to the war menu. So you get these options. Continue campaign. Just unfortunately, once you've clicked on a strategic action country, you can't go back and evaluate other options. You have to implement something. And once you've clicked an option, you're stuck with it. Unless you've saved the game, which I don't. So you have the following logos. So the rifle indicates infantry and their relative strength. This logo represents heavy tanks. This logo represents jets. This logo represents light tanks. This logo represents SAM systems, and this logo represents anti-tank helicopters. There's also another option here for, neither belligerent has them in this war, but anti-SAM helicopters. So yeah, so obviously SAMs do what they. So obviously anti-tank helicopters fight tanks. SAM systems fight jets and helicopters. They are not very effective though against the specific anti-SAM helicopters. I believe, although I don't know all the mechanics behind it, that light tanks and heavy tanks sort of support the infantry more. Generally, in this war, it would be a good idea to maybe try to pursue the air superiority. So there seems to be a mechanic. I don't fully understand the war stuff in this game, so I've never fully been able to look under the hood of this game. I generally like to pursue a sort of balanced military, seems to be the best. One time I tried to sort of spec heavily into just buying loads and loads and loads and loads of jets, but then the AI bought like 1,000 SAMs and I was out of luck. So generally pursuing a balanced military is a good idea, like maybe 2,000 of these, 1,000 or so of these, 500 of these, 200 or so, 250 anti-tank helicopters, 250 anti-SAM helicopters, or like 150. So if you have good SAMs and anti-SAM helicopters, you can really pursue air superiority, which seems to sort of make a bit of a difference in the way that the front moves. So in this case, maybe buying 5 jets would be good, because if you do the war screen, the strategic action, before you do the purchasing arms, you can see what you need. So there's another little nuance. The first menu you see when you skip on is purchase arms menu. If you go to strategic action and you're currently in a long war, you might be able to see what you're good on, what you're not so good on. So, you might want to say pursue, being as you're ahead in tanks, you might want to pursue the air superiority. You cannot buy infantry in the same way. you sort of like that again. I don't fully understand the mechanics of that, but you sort of have this 450,000 reserves here. That sort of shows you how many you've lost, because the dead soldiers come out of your reservists. So whenever a soldier dies, they're brought into the main army. So you might see, if you've been in a war for a few turns, it might say 400,000 reserves. Now, you can lose all your reserves. It's never happened though to me. I've got the reserves to 100k when I was in this. I can't remember which episode it was, but I was in this grinding war with Egypt, which just had no resolution to it. And yeah, their military did complain that so many dead, we have less than 100k to call up. But then I lost the game. I think Egypt nuked me after that. So yeah, I don't know exactly what this number does, because obviously, it says 40,000 troops, but it says, I think I had all 7 on there. It said 964. So again, I would need to know under the hood, but I would just look for those relative numbers. In these wars. So yeah, I'll just say again, a balanced military seems to be the best thing to pursue. Balanced military, but you're trying to make a play for having more jets. Right. So again, I'll sort of get onto the headline system of the game here. So like if you see something like, so there's loads of different ones for border disputes. So it will be, say, I'll just do Syria and Israel, for example. You'll see Syrian border towns feel Israeli army presence. That's a border dispute. Light damage done by Syrians on Israel. That's a border dispute. Syrian army maneuvers interfere with Israeli borders, or let's have a look. Syrian leader says Israeli premier is totally mad, or XYZ claims airspace violation by XYZ, whatever. That means it's a border dispute and the relations have gone lamentable. Next term they go deplorable. Next term war. It's never gone other way. A lot of the war ones are a bit less useful. So like short tank battle puts Israel in dominant position. That might not mean you're advancing the front line. It might just mean you've killed a lot of enemy tanks. Yeah, so yeah, or hostility towards XYZ ups Middle East tension. That generally means there's maybe an alliance coming against a country. So that could be, say, Israeli-Iraqi alliance, which is going after Jordan. So another one is, if the West is concerned with Middle East nuclear situation, that means a country has developed nukes. You can tell when a country has developed nukes because if I just go back to sort of say Egypt, they'll have like a nuclear station little logo there. If it turns into an explosion, that means they have nukes. It'll say recent tremor evidence of atomic testing, or WITS, or intelligence has detected a nuclear explosion. That means that country has nukes. You will still be given the option to bomb their nuclear facilities. However, it does nothing. There is another little thing under the hood as well, which I haven't seen, where you can be at war with a nuclear power. It seems kind of random whether they actually nuke you or not, though. It seems to be maybe whether I've had wars going badly for them and they nuke me, wars going well for them and they nuke me. There's some mechanic under the hood, which I don't know. So I will talk more about maybe extreme measures here, because I talked about them before. but I'll bring them up again. So basically, this only really matters when you're, say, for instance, if you're at war with a country, their government is now locked into failing in the next few turns. So, say, for instance, they're dangerously weak. I don't know the exact order they're going to go. Dangerously weak. They're going to go, yeah, weak, fragile, dangerously weak, close to revolution, gone. If you just click support insurgents, support insurgents, support insurgents. But say, for instance, you can try, there's a little bit of a risk, but you can try to, using the extreme actions, get rid of them fast. So if I'm losing a war versus Egypt, I might say, at, say, weak, I might go for an assassination of their president or starting a coup. I think they're both, if either is successful, the game wins, but I don't know if there's any nuance. Sometimes when you click assassinate leader and it fails, it will say the leader is recovering in hospital. So I don't know if that specifically relates to anything. Maybe the country fails a little bit faster after, but so sort of like, it's sort of like a risk, but you can get them to fail faster. And sometimes you need them to fail faster because you're at war with them, or they're developing nukes and you don't want them to have nukes, etc. But it only really works when they're weak internally. So I have done that in some of my games where I'm losing a war with Syria badly. I sort of go all in. I try and coup them, even though if I lose, I'm, sacrificing my insurgent group, and I'd have to build it up again possibly next turn. But I'll also tell you another final nuance which has actually won me games, is that intelligence resolves before wars. So that is, if I select do the coup and nuclear weapons, if the coup is successful, there's no nuclear weapon, so that's the way it resolves it within the game. So I say thermonuclear strike and coup, the coup works, the nukes don't go off. And that can be very valid for sort of like covering your base as well, because nukes come with a very big cost. You have to go to private dealer. You can no longer buy light tanks because he doesn't sell them. And also you get arms embargoed. Oh yeah, that's the same thing. And also you do not receive any US financial aid. I believe after a year or so after you lose nukes, but likely the game's going to be over by then, you can have your arms embargo lifted. But I've only ever seen that once or twice. I think it was an off-camera game years ago. So yeah, I'll just mention this here. That's the weapons you bought this turn. I should also note that bombers play no role in wars themselves. So buying a bunch of them doesn't really matter. You start off with 5. You might burn through 10 in a single game, possibly, if you do a lot of bombing of nuclear reactors. So what I might do is, I think I've covered the bulk of the mechanics of the game. So also as well, if you're at war and you're in the process of developing nuclear weapons, and last time it said 1 month, do your nuclear club first. Because say for instance, you go to strategic action, implement all your stuff, and then go to nuclear club, and it says deploy nuclear weapons and you get the nuclear weapons, you then can't go back and use them. So it would be better to do nuclear club first. Nuclear club, strategic action, then purchase arms is the order. It's probably best to do them if you're actually at a war. So I'll cover here some game situations. So let's just say you have very strong relations with Egypt. So it's an early game situation. You have very strong relations with Egypt. you are okay relations with Jordan. Jordan is not as likely to attack. But you see that Iraq is about to go to war with Syria. And Lebanon has okay relations as well. Lebanon doesn't really matter here. So what would you do? So I'll sort of give it a few seconds. So what I would normally do is I would try to... Now you can sort of end up with a bit of pie on your face in a way, because what can happen is, if I'm good with Egypt, I go to hit Syria, or I can potentially blood list war them. So the way the opposition factions work in this game is, if say I deploy forces, I'll just bring up this screen, on the Syrian border, regardless of relations, they could be the best relations in the world, and I might not be able to go to war without degrading the relations on 6 times, because you have to be, I think you have to be indifferent. I think you have to be either indifferent, lamentable, or deplorable to actually invade them. So if you've got, say if you've got excellent relations, I believe your relations can only degrade once per turn. So if you had excellent relations, a country is going to have to go excellent. It's going to have to go break pact if you have a defense pact. Then it's going to have to go profitable. I can't remember. Profitable, workable, satisfactory, indifferent, lamentable, deplorable war. So it actually takes a long time sometimes to get to war with a country. If that was the case, if that makes any sense, you have to degrade the relations. You can't just like instantly full deploy and go for it unless you're indifferent. So even if they've got the strongest relations ever, if I small scale deploy to Syrian border, the Syrians would put 1 unit there. So if I put 1 unit there, the Syrians will put 1 unit there. And that's a really good idea, because now they have less to take on Iraq. What I've sometimes had happen is turn 1, I see Syria and Iraq are about to go to war. I place on the Syrian border. I go to sort of attack. Maybe my relations with Egypt weren't super strong yet. And then Iran joins in, and then you've got Iran and Syria crush Iraq. That's sometimes a bit of bad fortune which can go. So Iraq ends up in an unsustainable 2-front war. So that can happen in that situation, but it may be sort of like generally in that situation, I would go plant on the border with Syria and maybe not even go to war with them, because the great thing is if you've got, say, favourable relations, you can pull off your troops and they can't actually attack you. You have to have bad relations before you can attack someone in this game. So yeah, that's sort of an example game state which is quite common. Iraq and Syria want to go to war. That can be a very good chance, but also a little bit of a risk to get rid of Syria early on. If you get rid of Syria early on, you're in a very good, strong position. If you can get rid of either Egypt or Syria early on, you're likely to win. Well, maybe not likely to win. I'd say games where you get Egypt on you instantly. If you get Egypt on you instantly and you don't have strong relations with Libya, you're probably likely to be in a very bad way. So I'll go for another sort of game state. This one is, if I'm very strong with Egypt relations-wise, I'm very strong with Syria, I would actually go to then take out Jordan for all the, not Jordan, Lebanon, if I can degrade those relations fast enough. I may even intervene on the side of the government to stabilize them for the purposes of making them sort of last long enough for me to degrade my relations with them. Because generally, I would say that you can handle a two-front war with Jordan and Lebanon. You can do that. So I think Lebanon can be done with one force. You can win. I think Syria, you need all 7 to win. Egypt, you need all 7 to kind of hold against them. Jordan, I predict it's 3. I haven't been in that many game situations, so I've done 2 and 2 I lose. 2 you are not beating Jordan with 2. So maybe it might be 3 or 4, but that's easily maneuverable. You can put 1 on, you can do small scale deployment to Lebanese border, large scale deployment to Jordan. That would be 5 and 2 and 5 respectively on the borders. So if I have really good relations with Egypt, Syria, I would then try and go and get Lebanon to try and then degrade Syria in the long run. It can be important as well if you notice sort of there's a storyline early on where I would say as well, if I'm very good with Egypt in terms of relations, I may then play the game of try to coup Libya to try and stop Egypt from stabilising. It's a very simple game which can be played in under an hour, but there really is quite a lot of depth. There's also quite a bit of luck to it. I currently, for instance, have a on-camera record, probably slightly worse than my off-camera record of 6 wins, 10 losses in this game. I've actually learned quite a lot along the way to hopefully input the strategy ideas into the game. If I was very good with Egypt, yeah, I may try to sort of coup Libya. So yeah, I don't know if there's too much to cover thus far. Maybe to progress further with my knowledge of this game, I will maybe need to have someone look under the hood a bit more. So like work out, obviously we know that, SAMs are anti-aircraft weapons, for example, but 125 SAMs to 140 jets. How many jets will that number of SAMs take out in a turn? What does it exactly depend on? What does, etc.? I don't know because I haven't looked under the hood. So, as well, I will notice there's one sort of final tip here I will give for two front wars. So I believe it will say maybe here or maybe when you actually go to the border activity section, it will say maybe we have full scale deployment, the enemy is at full deployment strength or something like that. That means they have at least 5 brigades there and you have at least 5 there. If it says the enemy front has small scale activity or some activity, we're at full deployment strength, you then really want to be clicking invade, because in those circumstances you will probably win that within a turn. That may happen if you're in a 2-front war. Say for instance if it's Jordan and Iraq are in a war, you deploy one turn to say the Jordanian border, you might get the message, we're at full deployment strength, they have some activity. That means you potentially outnumber the enemy 5-1 on that border, and you should definitely go for it. I think it's either in here or it's in the other box, or when you click onto the border itself. So that's another little nuance with regards to sort of maneuvering. Now, most of the time, unless it's a 2-front war, you deploy 5, they're going to deploy 5. So another thing I'd sort of finally point out, which I don't know again because I haven't seen under the hood of the game, whether it's better to they go lamentable, relations go lamentable, you full scale deploy, and then relations inevitably go deplorable. And then is it better to deploy your final 2 units there or click invade? Because you'll have those two options. It may be better. I'm sort of working on the idea that invade is actually better, although I haven't seen under the hood of the game. It's just sort of like maybe a more subjective feeling of mine, that maybe full scale deploy invade is the best thing to do in your 2 pre-war turns, as it were. So I think there I've covered potentially every aspect, least of this game, or an overwhelming majority of it. So I'll say, again, I am Dr. Ivermectin, so I just play this game for fun. My sort of main social media content is on my Twitter will be a lot different. So it's going to be pro-vaccine stuff, anti-misinformation stuff. I'm one of the co-hosts of a monthly show, Lads on Tour, where we interview a lot of personalities. Like last one was Brian Deere, the sort of guy who exposed the Andrew Wakefield's fraudulent paper that vaccines caused autism. And before, we've interviewed ex-anti-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers and immunologists and stuff like that. So I'm also the seller of a book called COVID-19 Ultimate Misinformation, which is currently on sale. I think I'll keep it on sale forever, to be honest. It's not getting many more sales these days. Probably say the price has permanently come down to that. Yeah, so I just sort of play this game in my spare time. It's a bit of fun. I've got about 15, 16 episodes on my YouTube where there's actual game situations. So this all might not make a lot of sense if you haven't seen a game yet. I'll put it in the description that it's probably, or maybe edit it in, that it's probably better to have watched at least one of my games before, so you can sort of see me clicking through all the menus and that sort of, or have played the game yourself. So this game is completely free. It came out in the 90s. It was made by one developer for Virgin Mastertronic called David J. Eastman. He's still around today on Twitter. I've spoken to him. He's seen some of my episodes as well. So, yeah, follow him if you're on. In addition to following me, of course. He makes other games. He's made 2 more games. So another one is a game from the 90s called Floor 13, which, to be honest, I never really got my head around that much. It's kind of a bit more obtuse. It's where you run a secret spy agency in Cold War Britain. You can sort of like order your teams to assassinate people or run smear campaigns against them, etc. It had a sequel called Floor 13 Deep State, because of course you had to name it that in today's political climate, where I've never really got my head around it that much as well. Where it's sort of the same thing, you play a spy agency. So, yeah. Is that... Oh yeah, finally I'll say, if you enjoy these videos, there's an option to potentially give me free money on Ko-Fi. Only one person has done so thus far. And that was months ago, sort of, for my book. So, yeah, I think I've finally covered everything. So, I am for the last time ivermectin, and I wish all of my adoring fans a Merry Christmas, 8 months too early. How's about that?